personal experiences with them. And I guess this is round two of that, where today we're going to talk a bit more about modern Stoicism, and Coco will tell us how to discuss that, and will show me how to do goal setting within Stoicism, because it's I haven't really figured out how that works.
Yeah. What do you mean by figured out how that works?
Well,
Like,
I'm not sure. Like, so to me, Stoicism always seemed like it's designed for someone that has a very hectic life, and you use Stoicism
mm,
to like chill out and and be able to handle more load. Uh, but it never. I was never able to figure out a way to say, if I plan something long term and what do I want through the lens of Stoicism, uh, how would I decide what that is, and how would I set goals towards it?
hmm. Okay, so yeah, I definitely think that Stoicism is for more than just people who have like a stressful or hectic life, but also like good on you for thinking that you don't. Don't you have kids?
Yeah, but I I don't know. I handle things well, so I and I get bored easily. So I mean, I think at the time, like, I had a very hectic job, and that was what was
Mm-hmm.
more difficult. And also at the
Mm-hmm.
time, not by not not on purpose, but my dog of 11 years was starting to get very ill,
Yeah,
and
we talked about this a little bit.
yeah, and Stoicism was really really helpful for that period. And I know a lot of people like regret when something like that happens. A lot of people regret, oh, I didn't spend enough time. And while practicing Stoicism, I do not at all have that regret. Like, I knew in advance it was going to happen, and I took certain steps, and I do not regret that because I took actions before that happened. Um, doesn't mean I wasn't sad, but still.
Well, but I don't think that Stoicism would necessarily require that you not be sad. But I will
Yeah, yeah,
say,
yeah.
like, our modern interpretation of Stoicism, in my opinion, is more based off of like later Stoicism. One of the weird things about Greek philosophy is that it was kind of like there were always these really, I guess, there's a lot of animosity between the schools of teaching because they were so associated with aristocracy and with royalty. So like one senator would listen to or would like take the teachings of one guy and then bring that into the way that he would do governance, and another guy would listen to a different philosopher and bring that into the way that he did governance. So like I think a lot of us think of Stoicism as being like all of Greek thought for like a certain time period, but it was really just like a specific school of Greek thought. um, and I think that what most of our modern, like the people who are taking modern Stoicism, are mostly operating from the writings of Marcus Aurelius in his journals, because I think Aurelius accidentally adapted Stoicism into something very similar to modern talk therapy.
Okay. I mean, I guess I want to give like a way I understood Stoicism to develop. So
Hmm.
as far as I know, we had Aristotle,
Hmm.
and the Stoics took something from Aristotle, specifically the concept of eudaimonia, and
Hmm.
they developed. I don't know if they took every single thing that he said, but they took the concept of eudaimonia and they interpreted in the way that uh, you need to stay in order to stay in like a state of eudaimonia, where like you're content and nothing upsets you. You can't necessarily get attached to things that if they are gone, they may upset you. Or there's the concept of locus of control, or things you can't control you shouldn't get upset over, and things you can control you should work on developing, specifically your virtues. So that and the schools, the two big names that I'm familiar with. I mean, there are more, but it's Marcus Aurelius, but Epictetus was pretty big, especially since his journey was he started off as a slave and then he opened his own school. And
Mm-hmm.
There's a point of view from that, whereas Marcus Aurelius, again, both really very good, very good Stoics. And I think there was another one, Seneca, or am I
Yeah,
confusing?
Seneca. I'm pretty sure it
Um,
was Seneca. I know that there is another one. I know Aurelius writes a lot about Epictetus.
oh, does he? Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
well, because a part of Stoicism is like looking at your life and looking at, or at least part of my experience with Stoicism is like looking at your life and thinking like, okay, well, like, you know, why do I feel certain ways about my life? Why do I think certain things about the world? Like, kind of examining that in a much more surface level way than like cognitive behavioral therapy would, because it's not
mhm.
necessarily getting at the trauma that underlies the behavior, but it is
So,
looking at the behavior objectively.
so is this the end of the day kind of introspection that Stoics have?
I don't necessarily know if it's like an end of the day thing. I do think you're talking about eudaimonia and being in a state of like being in that state of eudaimonia.
Okay.
In my opinion, the way that I've kind of interpreted stoicism is that it's a constant awareness of us in a specific way. It's a constant awareness of your actions as you move through the world. So like I am no longer just operating on the autopilot setting of I'm going to get up, I'm going to make my coffee, I'm going to smoke my cigarette, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this. Like
Hmm.
now you're actively thinking like I am going to wake up, I'm going to contemplate my coffee. I'm going to think like how great is it that I have coffee? What would it be like if I
Oh,
didn't have coffee? I would
right.
mindfully consider this thing that's in my life. I would mindfully consider the cigarette and maybe consider, is this good for me? Is this beneficial? Is this something that's bringing me whatever? Like, um, I think part of why I find Stoicism to be so fascinating and so pragmatic is because almost all of our modern ways of refining our lives, all of these like self-help books that everybody reads, like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, like you could trace that directly back to the way that Stoics examined their lives, in my opinion, which I think is really good and is also why I think those books are trash.
I remember something in Stoicism where you're supposed to look at the world with childlike wonder. Like there was an example
Hmm.
where you see like a glass of water, and it's like, oh my God, I can see through this glass and look at the water, and isn't it amazing? Like just think about it. It's like
Hmm.
1,000 years ago, we would never be able to
Hmm.
see through this glass, and like I really appreciate the beauty of a glass of water, and it seemed like like a sort of being grateful for just being.
Hmm. Yeah, I would definitely say that that's part of it for sure. Is that like we should look at our lives as being like bountiful in things that we should be thankful for, and be able to like handle the disappointment of not having those things at the same time. You know, there's a practice in stoicism uh that I've really adopted that I love, where let's say I'm getting into a situation where I feel uncomfortable, or I am like worried or scared or nervous. um I will look at that situation and be like, okay, well, what is the worst possible thing that I can imagine happening? Like, um, I think 2 week or not this last Friday, but the Friday before that, I was being dumb with a knife, and I was trying to pry apart 2 pieces of frozen meat, and I took the knife and I was like angling it in towards my hand, and the knife went through the meat, but it also went through the container and then into my hand by about like probably an inch and a
Oh,
half, maybe. It was gnarly. And when I cut it, I wasn't sure, and I started to immediately freak out. Um, and I was like, you fucking idiot. How could you possibly do this? Like, I love to cook, and I've worked in construction most of my life. So the fact that this is the thing that hurt my hand is crazy to me, because I've done so many more stupid things near my fingers and my hands. And because I'm a musician and a writer, like I need all of my fingers to work pretty damn well. So I immediately went into panic mode, and my girlfriend, who had just moved into me, like at this point, or moved in with me, like she hasn't even been living here for 2 weeks. Today's 3 weeks that she's been living here. Um, and so like I told her, like, I'm not sure, but we might need to go get stitches. I might need to go get stitches. And I was freaking out because I was thinking ER, like emergency room. And I just had to pause and be like, what's the worst thing that could happen right now? Like the worst thing that could happen is I do something dumb and I end up not getting the stitches in time, or like not doing the right thing. My hand gets infected and I die or lose my arm. And I thought to myself, like, can I live with that? Would I be able to make it through that? Because I think what Stoicism does is it tries to get at some of the more instinctual ways in which we interact with the world and undermine them using the functions of our prefrontal cortex. If we want to talk about neuroscience. So what I was basically doing was subverting my flight or fight response with logic, because our body's not logical, in my opinion. Our body is responsive. Our body jumps from one extreme to the other. It goes from like being totally fine to thinking that it's about to die within a span of 2 seconds. So my body thought it was going to fucking die. And I had to like pause, undermine that so that I could make a wise decision. And I ended up going to urgent care instead of going to the hospital. And I saved myself probably like thousands of dollars.
Why? Can you explain to me what's the difference between those two cares?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Urgent care in America, we have hospitals, and we have these little like clinics, and we call them urgent care facilities. And so like going to a hospital in America is super expensive because of the way that they do medical billing. Basically, there's the hospitals they don't have to compete with each other in pricing. So they just bill the insurance companies whatever rate they want to, because the insurance companies will pay it, because there's not enough infrastructure outside of hospitals to support a competitive market for insurance billing. And
Okay.
because of the way that the government has subsidized healthcare, HMOs, which I don't even know if you guys have HMOs versus PPOs in Europe. Is that a thing?
We largely have single, like national health insurance, national health care.
That's what I thought. Yeah. So in America, you have HMOs and PPOs. HMOs is like a health network, which is like Kaiser. So basically, you can only go to Kaiser doctors and Kaiser facilities.
Oh,
And then
yes. Okay.
doctors pay to be a part of that network, and they get to then bill Kaiser insurance. Well, I have a PPO, which basically means that when I go to the hospital, insurances like fucking they rail me. They bill like ludicrous amounts. I went to a follow-up doctor's appointment, and the doctor billed that appointment that took 30 minutes. He billed it for $400 for a 30-minute appointment.
Okay.
So when I go to a hospital, it just costs an insane amount of money. And part of what I was talking about with like the stoicism and this practice of like imagining what's the worst possible thing that could happen and would I be able to live through it, you know, I was able to pause and remember, like, oh, I think I've heard that I don't have to go to the ER just to get stitches. I can go someplace else. And but
Uh,
in remembering that, like, I think instead of it being like a $1,300 insurance bill, um, for going to the ER, because like if you walk into an ER in America, you're basically paying $1,000. That's it. Like the minimum to walk into an ER is $1,000. You may as well just write the check as soon as you walk through the door. And that doesn't even like if you go to the emergency room by ambulance, like you're looking at like 8 to 9 grand. It's crazy. So I in being able to calm myself down, like I was able to like walk around, keep my hand elevated, and like not freak myself out so much that I did something stupid.
mhm.
And that I think is part of the like one of the big values of stoicism, is that like you have the ability to kind of undermine the lesser parts of your, or the less desirable, I guess would be the right word, the less desirable parts of your instinct,
Think
because
think
there
more.
are definitely lesser desirable parts.
Would you say it's you're able to calm down your emotions and think more rationally?
Somewhat, yeah, yeah. I don't know if I necessarily love the idea. Well, no, it is rationally. Yeah, it is rationally. I would say I'm able to calm down my emotions and think and behave in a rational manner. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I had this sort of like a negative visualization about a job I thought I was gonna lose, which I did in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And like I just did like what's the worst that can happen, and several like ways of how it could go wrong, and then I like how can I reduce the risk of it going terribly wrong, and take steps in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing like cutting my hand, obviously, but and I was
I
able to do
mean,
it. Yeah,
but that's one of the crazy things about your brain is that like it doesn't know the difference between cutting your hand and getting fired from a job. Like your brain is just an organ,
yeah.
ultimately. Your brain is a tool that you get to choose how to use. And so like you thinking I might not have the ability to provide for myself. I don't know if you were married and had kids at the time, provide for
I was,
myself
yeah.
and provide for my family. Like to you, that is just as an equal amount of stress and anxiety as me slicing my hand open with a knife because I was being dumb, in my opinion. Like, so I think the fact that you're able to pause and take a look at that and be like, I think I need to chill out. I think that's admirable for sure. It's definitely not easy. Not everybody does it.
I would say yours was worse. I would say yours was more stressful than mine. But yeah, I
I
mean,
just don't like thinking in those terms, honestly. I just think it's really valuable to just kind of view all things in some capacity as being like as being equal because your brain views them as being equal. When I'm a little
mm,
kid, if my dad literally beat the shit out of me, it would traumatize me just as much as if he yelled at me or threatened to beat the shit out of me. Like it's the same kind of trauma. If you look at victims of PTSD, victims of people who have PTSD, then you look at people who experienced abuse in their childhood, the dude who watched his friend get blown up in Iraq during the early 2000s has the same brain scars, same brain scarring, same shit happening to his nerve endings that the person who was yelled at by their mom and dad um, and abused by their parents does. It's the same scarring. Your brain doesn't know the difference. Like think of it like skin, right? Like I play guitar. When I fret on the guitar, the ends of my fingers develop callus. When I play drums, uh, the inside of my palms develop callus, and
mhm.
so it's the same callus both ways, even though it's a completely different stimulus. Your brain's the same way, and I think that's part of why, again, why Stoicism is so valuable is because it's like, well, I don't really have much of a choice in the way that my brain interprets things. I only have a choice in the way that I interpret my brain.
I sometimes tell myself actually till today, and I haven't been practicing stoicism for a bit, that if I go through something painful, like if I'm experiencing like physical pain, or I'm gonna go to a doctor and then afterwards experience physical pain because or like a dentist or something, I tell
Hmm.
my or let's say I did something and all my body like really hurts the next day. I'll tell
Hmm.
myself I won't remember this a week from now, so it doesn't really matter.
That is a really, really good practice in my opinion, because you're like literally dead on. You won't remember that shit in a week. Your brain will forget it. Your body will remember it, but you consciously will forget it.
Yeah, it calms me down when I say it to myself.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, like, there it is, the value of stoicism staring us straight in the face. And what's funny, the same way that you're talking about like having these little practices of thinking things out and thinking like what's the worst thing that could happen to me, or like I'm not going to remember this in a week, right? All of those practices, what we're doing is or what I think stoicism is doing that they didn't know that they were doing is like training a Pavlovian response to trauma into your body in some capacity. What you're basically doing is just like ringing a metaphorical bell to get yourself to calm down because you are experiencing a specific kind of stimulus. That
Mm.
stimulus happens to be anxiety, stress, worry, like any number of negative emotions. And what you're basically doing is saying, like, no, I have the ability to respond to these in the way that I want to. And in the same that I think that the goal setting aspect, right, this virtuous way of being, this eudaimonia, is very similar. What you're basically doing is training yourself to undermine your reward systems in your brain. So like instead of your brain needing some big grandiose thing in order to get off, in order to have dopamine, you're basically starving your brain for dopamine by being calm, by being thoughtful. And so your brain's like, whoa, how do I get ahead of this shit? Because your brain gets addicted to the things that your body does, right? That's why we get addicted to working out. That's why we get addicted to like having sex, right? Um, so you're basically just trying to get your brain addicted to a specific thing. And that specific thing in Stoicism, in my opinion, is you're trying to get your brain addicted to small victories, because small victories are achievable, whereas large victories are rare. So what you're trying to do is basically like set the stage for success. You know, it's like the clean your room principle with Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think is kind of similar in a weird way. Like, imagine you're in a room and it's dark and you've just woken up you've just woken up and you're going to try to start working out today. Like you haven't worked out in months and you're like, I'm going to get up early. I'm going to do it. I'm going to make sure, like, even if my kids go to bed late, I'm setting the alarm. I'm getting up early. I'll be sleep deprived. It's fine. I'll take a shot of pre-workout, whatever. Um, so you get up, you do it. But like, you didn't clean the room the night before, so there's a bunch of shit all over the floor and you like trip and fall or you sprain your ankle because you left something on the floor that you didn't know was there because you're walking around in the dark. Like
Yeah.
stoicism is basically like, I'm walking around that room and picking up one thing and saying like, good job, great for you for picking up that one thing. Well, now the path to success is one thing clearer, right? There's one less thing in your way.
Okay, so
Can
So
I-
then
let's
Can
stick with this. So I'm unfamiliar with the small victories thing in Stoicism. So to me, this is new, and I think it leads to the larger successes. So could you expand on like the connection between small victories and the larger success, and and how through Stoicism do we know what that larger success is or should be?
yeah, who was that? Was that Arco? Arco, did you jump
I
in for a
just wanted-
second?
You can
It
answer
was
that question,
me.
but you can answer that question, Koco. But I
He
do
is
want
on,
to
but
add
he's
some
muted.
things. I'm not
Oh,
muted.
yeah.
1 second.
So go answer that. But then I do want to. The second part of that question, I have an answer for with a view of modern Stoicism that is compelling, I think. But go ahead, Koco.
Yeah, thank you, man. Yeah, so as far as like small goal setting, so like I was talking about with the room, so I think a lot of us think of like, let's say I have this really big goal of I want to dress up as Zangief from Street Fighter for Halloween, which means that I'm not going to be able to wear any clothes other than just like a little like piece of underwear because that's what he wears in the game. So I want to look really good. I want like a six pack. I want like pecs. I want nice shoulders. Like I want this body, right? But like we think about the body that we want or the thing that we want. Like I want to make $100,000 a year. That's definitely something that's on my plate right now that I want to do. Um, like we're thinking about that and thinking of it as like this is this one monolith that I'm going to be able to just like go out and grab. You know, I'm going to walk right up to it like I'm in a fucking video game. There's going to be 3 chests in front of me and I'm going to pick the one that says you made $100,000 this year. But like that's not the case. The case is that to make $100,000 a year, 99.99% of the time, there's a myriad of steps that you have to go through before you can get there. And this is true, in my opinion, of all goals. Like even a small goal of like my sister, she and her boyfriend just broke up and she's very, very sad about it. So I sent her a text this morning and I just said like, hey, you should set a small goal for yourself, something that's achievable. Like I'm going to eat breakfast by 10 a.m. today. And that might seem small, right? It is small in the grand scheme of things, but like if you were to read Stoicism, it would say that everything you do is small in the grand scheme of things, and that's part of the point of Stoicism, which I think is beautiful, but also tragic. But I mean, welcome to real life. It's beautiful and tragic. But in doing these small little things, you're basically like kind of completing a puzzle because the eventual goal for my sister or the person who wants to work out and look like Zangief or the person who wants to make $100,000 a year is this very complex thing of being successful in the way that they want to be successful. And ultimately, like no success is built on one singular piece of foundation. It's all a bunch of little pieces of foundation. I mean, look at the way that they built anything, you know? it's not as if they just took one big giant rock and laid it down and then said, all right, build on top of it. You have to move different pieces. You put structural supports in the exact right place. And in my opinion, that's what the small victories are doing. You're basically just saying, like, I'm establishing habits that are going to solicit structural support upon which I can build success. And that's the way that I look at modern Stoicism, is that, like, it's giving me the tools to program my brain to be more realistic about the ways in which I can achieve the things that I want to achieve.
I just need a point of clarification for my benefit. Is there a risk of saying, if I don't get Zangief's body, and then I'll lose my eudaimonia, and I'll be upset? Is that how I should? Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good. You're good. I think that's a great question. I think that the answer, in a funny way, is kind of like, it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. If I'm a Stoic and I'm looking at my goal and I say to myself, like, I want this thing, then the risk is that I won't get it. Well, then I get to practice another aspect of Stoicism and say, well, what's the worst thing that could happen if I don't get it? I show up to this Halloween party and people make fun of me. Like, fuck them. I still did lots of work. I can still be happy with my results, even if they're not perfect. Stoicism, in a weird way, is more about acceptance than it is about achieving things. You're just accepting what it is that happens based off of your actions, rather than thinking that your actions caused something. You're accepting all of the things that were caused by your actions. And I know that seems like a weird, just like a rhetorical flip, which is all that it really is. But, like, that's part of the eudaimonia, is accepting that your actions have ramifications that exist outside of your individual will.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I was about to say go ahead, but then Philo had a question.
So one thing that I want to present is how the ancient Stoics talked about, like, our emotions versus our rationality. There tended to be this view that, like, we have these sort of animal instincts, and then we have this, like, rational element of ourselves. And that rational element is that which, like, controls our animal instincts. That's the emotional side. And then that dichotomy got put into a lot of Western thinking for a long period of time, and I think to this day is still a big part of the way we think of ourselves. But there's a modern Stoic view where our emotions are not separate from our cognitive abilities or our intelligence, and in fact, our emotions are picking out things that we value. Just to give you an example, let's say you're hiking in the woods and you come across a bear. With that information, we don't know enough about how the person's going to react, because if a person loves bears, they're going to be freaking out and be like, oh my God, this is so cute. This is so cool. But if a person is afraid of bears, they're going to have a very different reaction. Their emotions are going to be anxiety and fear. They're going to want to run away. And the point of that example is to show that our emotions are picking out things that are valuable to us. So this is one of the things I think that the ancient Stoics got wrong, which is that our emotions are separate from our rationality. I think our emotions are downstream from our beliefs. So when we see things in the world, we have a cognitive appraisal of those things. We are judging them, and our emotions are the immediate judgments of those things. So one thing the ancient Stoics did is because of that dichotomy, they had a normative position, which is that you shouldn't like lean into those emotions too much. You should sort of reject the animalistic side of your emotions. And that's sort of where the stereotype of Stoicism as being, like, colorless comes into play. Although it's arguable that Seneca even had that view. But the point here is that the modern neo-Stoic view incorporates the emotions as something intelligent, as something that guides our judgments. Martha Nussbaum talks about this a lot, where when we have something like grief, we're picking out something that we really valued about what is lost. Or when we have something like anger, we're picking out some kind of injustice. And the Stoic response, like you pointed out earlier, Koco, is like, okay, what steps do I need to move towards to reach my goal? But what is setting the goals, what's helping set our judgment, is this emotional side. So I think a really compelling neo-Stoic view is incorporating those emotions and rationality together as a unity, um, to pick out the things we value in our lives and to work towards those goals to have a life that's flourishing.
Um, I'm familiar with Nussbaum. I'm like, I agree and disagree with what's your point. I do agree that emotions kind of, I, I would phrase it differently. I would phrase it, we value certain things, and we can, through Stoicism, decide which values to go for rationally. And I think that our emotions then tell us if we're on the right track to achieve those values. So they are downstream of rationality, and they are helpful. Did I lose Coco? They are.
Yeah, sorry.
They are helpful to tell us if we're on the right track to achieving our values. Where I may draw the line is to rely on emotions to, like, epistemologically, to describe the situation. I'm not sure if that's necessarily what you were saying, Arco, but that's where I would say emotions aren't like a good way to say, to understand reality, for example.
Yeah, but I just don't
Yeah,
think
I
that we
think
can
that's fair.
necessarily separate out emotions from logic. Like I think logic is driven by emotions in some capacities.
I feel like what philosophical zombie is trying to pick out here is that, our emotions have a fallibility, and
Of course, but so does our logic.
Yeah, that's true. Our rationality is a tool we would use to try and pick out what's fallible about our emotions. And I think maybe, Coco, you would say, well, also our emotions are a tool for us to help pick out what's bad about our logic.
100%. Absolutely, 100%. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I don't think empathy is a logical faculty in some capacity. Like, it might be logical if you could explain an evolutionary need for it, right? Which I'm sure that there are plenty of ways in which we can do that. But I'm not necessarily sure that I would subscribe to any of them as being particularly valuable. I would just think of them as being like maybe a useful way to try and describe this odd phenomena. But empathy, if it's driven by emotion, is incredibly valuable to our success, especially now, because the way that success looks for us as biological creatures now, is very different from how it would have looked when we perhaps had a different way of being. And so, like, our emotion is able to give us the ability to engage in certain ways that logic just cannot give us.
I guess I have like a direction for a conversation here. There was a ancient Greek, or sorry, maybe ancient Roman, I'm not sure, general who was a Stoic. I do forget the name, but he was fighting Julius Caesar at the time, and he took it very, very seriously, and he put all his effort into it. Now, from Marcus Aurelius, the decision to do something like this, the decision to set the goal like this, was because we are part of society. We have to serve other people. That is our call in life, and that is why you should set those kinds of goals, and that's why that general did as well. The question, the I don't know if it's a question or the direction is, did he set that goal because he was passionate about, let's say, justice, or he was passionate about, like, emotionally, he was passionate about justice, or he had a value for helping his fellow man, and he saw Julius Caesar as violating that value? How would you interpret that?
That's a good
Yes.
question. I get,
Go
on
ahead,
my
Arco. I've been
view,
talking a lot.
on my view, I sort of see them happening simultaneously. Like, I don't know if one comes before the other, but they kind of arise together. And then we might talk about one or the other, but like the sensation or the urgency, the thrust of that motivation, I think comes together, and then we have both an emotional part of that and then the rational part of that that we express.
Yeah, well, and I think that this is part of where I would depart from ancient practices of Stoicism, is that they would try and, in my opinion, they would probably try to claim that part of the reason that, you do certain things in ancient Stoicism is because you can like logically justify having chosen to do those things. And so there's like a logical element there of like, oh, well, it makes logical sense for me to care about this, or I am justified in caring about um I'm justified in caring about this in a particular way or in doing this specific action because I can like logically explain why I would do it. But like ultimately, the thing that underlies that logic is an emotional appeal to yourself. It's not that like, there was actually some sort of justice that could be carried out in the way that this guy was thinking about it. It was that justice would be carried out in the way that he thought it ought to be carried out. And he had an emotional attachment to that kind of justice, which, I mean, that part of why I like Stoicism, it's about acceptance. Like, so you just have to accept that it is the case that like you're emotionally appealing to yourself to do things all the time. You can't logically explain hardly anything, in my opinion. So like the ability to have emotions as a tool rather than as a like the ruler is really valuable. So like the ancient Stoic would say, like, this guy did this based off of logic and virtue and ethics and blah 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 blah. But like really, in my opinion, it just was that his emotional appeal to himself to get himself to do action happened to line up with the ethics, morals, and motivations at the time in some capacity. So we would
Well,
look at it, or he would look at it in a particular way.
I also think that our virtues are something that we pick out because of our emotions too. Like, for example, fairness or justice would be a virtue, right? But the way
Mm-hmm.
we understand something as just or unjust is that sensation of like resentment that pops up, or anger, right? So like, our emotions do line up with virtues, but I think our if we for a second just adopt a language game of like, we discover the virtues, our emotions are like that stick in the desert that help us find the water.
Yeah, I could agree with that. Well, it's like when I'm talking with a lot of people, sometimes I have to pause and remind myself, like, they don't have an opinion. Their opinion has them. And like, I think that's exactly what you're talking about. Is like, well, are we talking about someone's ability to like rationalize something, or are we talking about the fact that their rationality is controlled by their emotion? Well, we should take our rationality with us as a telescope into the desert to find the emotional marking point of where the oasis is, or
Right. Yeah,
vice
I think
versa.
I like that analogy of the emotions hold them, or the rationality holds them. On my view, to me, it seems like the Stoic would not be held by either.
Yes. But I think that ancient Stoics, and like this is getting into a little bit of like maybe an anthropological assumption, right? But I think that because we have so long, or society for so long, assumed that like masculine was a superior way of being, manliness was superior. Like even fucking Aristotle was sexist.
Well,
Like
that's just observable, Koco. What do you mean assume?
I'm sure.
I'm kidding. I'm
I don't know.
kidding.
I don't want to be
I'm kidding.
presumptuous. You're right. We can observe it. But what I'm just trying to think of a motivation
No,
as to
no. So,
why they wrote things the way that they did. And they associated being manly or masculine with being logical, and
mhm,
emotions with femininity. So of
mhm.
course they're going to say that the logic, right? This logical way of being is the right way of being. But really all they're doing is tainting the way of the way that they're looking at things with their own particular kind of like temporal hindrances, temporal obstacles.
I'm not sure about that one actually. I mean it makes a bit of sense the way you're saying it, but I think they were basing it off Aristotle, who had this whole concept of like virtue ethics, and he would
Yes.
say basically, you know, to have a good life, you have to be like a sage, and sages have all these qualities, including thinking rationally, and that's what you should do. I mean, he could have modeled off a male sage instead of a female sage. I you know, that could be
Oh,
the
I
case.
seriously doubt he modeled anything off of female anything, dude.
I'm just saying, like that's how we approach it. I don't know. I mean, it kind of makes sense with regards to males and like typically or like at the time stereotypically more rational, but I do think that, and maybe this is a point more of back to Stoicism, where like you are, there is the emotions, there is rationality, but you're supposed to develop something in yourself. You're supposed to, as you mentioned, handle things better. You're supposed to develop certain characteristics in yourself because that is something you can control.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, there's certain virtue is certainly a part of it, and that means that to live well, there is a right way to live, and you know, in order to do that, you have to develop the habits, the lifestyle, the dispositions to do that. So I think you've got that right, Zombie.
So what would a sage set himself as a goal?
Yeah.
Well, once you've reached sage status, I don't know, probably just like get drunk with the bros, hang out.
Like I've graduated, like I can do whatever.
I don't know. I think it's interesting. So most of my reading of modern Stoicism was focused heavily on Marcus Aurelius. And so Marcus had a friend or a son. It was a friend. He had a friend who he really loved, but his friend would like constantly imbibe in all of these vices. And Stoicism, at least in the way that Marcus Aurelius wrote about it and what I've interpreted, kind of frowned upon the idea of indulgence. So I think that like the sage ultimately lives in a very specifically ascetic kind of way. You know, it's not necessarily asceticism in the way that we would think of it, where it's like a complete denial, but the Stoic sage lives in a kind of asceticism where there's a denial of the self in indulging in things that are too rich, I think would be the way that I would describe it. So like I, as a Stoic sage, don't indulge in rich emotions. I indulge in realistic emotions. You know, it's not just in what you consume, it's also in how you act, how you are in the world.
So I can actually speak to that element. In the Stoicism that I read, there was a big, right at the very beginning, there was a big emphasis on trying to avoid the hedonic treadmill.
Well, because hedonism was a counteracting school of thought at the time.
Yeah. So like you can enjoy things, but you shouldn't get attached to them. So and Seneca, for example, was super rich, or Marcus Aurelius was the ruler of everything in the world that can tell anyone to do anything. But it's kind
of the Holy Roman Emperor, yeah.
Yeah. It was kind of funny that all the Stoics were like, they were like really, they were always focusing on like gratitude to tiny things, and you know, living a meek and or like a comfortable minus kind of existence. But they were like very successful, very rich. One moved to slavery to have his own school and many followers. It was always a very interesting kind of contrast between living a life where like you are often like viewing things like negatively, visualizing things in the future, but your life is actually really, really comfortable and good. So yeah, just specifically like not getting on the hedonic treadmill. Not examples were don't get attached to fine cheese, don't get attached to fine wine. Once a month, you know, go outside and like dress as a beggar just for one day, just so you can, you know, reset your taste preferences and like the things you're accustomed to. They were very much against the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's pretty reasonable. And also very intelligent and wise to do. God, I had a point here. So I think part of the reason that we're doing that, again, this idea of like resetting your expectations type of thing, is that you're basically setting up your body, setting up your mind to experience success and also to experience failure in in more meaningful or like purposeful ways. So like one way that I think about that I like to think about a lot of this stuff is that like success isn't about doing let's say financial success. My friends and I talk about the difference between poverty and wealth quite a lot. So like the difference between poverty and wealth, at least in America, isn't necessarily making the right decisions. It's about not making the wrong decisions. And so when I look at like my life, or my friends look at their life and say like, how is it that I become wealthy? How is it that I live a life that I can be proud of, or make the money that I want to make, or have the savings account that I want to make? It's not necessarily about like being in the right place at the right time. I mean, that helps quite a lot. We all know that, like nobody's wealth was built on intentionality. Their wealth was built on luck, in my opinion. I don't think anyone has success intentionally, at least not at first. But what you're basically doing is preparing yourself to not make bad decisions. Because when do you make the worst decisions? Well, in my opinion, it's when you're under stress. In my opinion, it's when you're sad. I try not to make decisions when I feel depressed. I try to be very like calm, collected, move forward slowly. But sometimes I don't have that choice. Sometimes I'm sitting in a house and the woman who I had moved into that house with, this happened like 2 years ago to me, is staring me in the face and saying like, I don't want to do this anymore. And we've been together for 5.5 years. My whole life is planned around being with this woman. I'm thinking about marrying her. I've changed my bank accounts over so that I can like be with her. We've spent money together. We've made financial decisions together, all this shit. And she's sitting across the table from me saying, I'm done. And like, I can't escape from that situation. I'm stuck with it. I'm right there. I mean, like, what am I going to do? Walk away? Just leave her there? Like, where our name is both on the lease. My ability to be successful depends on my ability to make good decisions in that moment. And if I haven't trained myself to be good at making decisions in that moment, then I'm going to totally fuck myself, in my opinion. And that is what I think the goal setting is about in Stoicism. It's about preparing yourself for situations in which you have no escape route, where you are more likely to make a bad decision than to make a good one. And so you're basically just preparing and practicing making good decisions in bad situations, because you're going to run into bad situations way more often than you are good ones.
If I could frame this a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that, speaking back to like the virtues and duties, there's there's a central duty. I'm not going to say like the primary duty, but a central duty.
Wait, you mean like what is it? A categorical duty?
No. Well, a categorical duty is what I did in the bathroom earlier. But there's a central duty towards your own well-being, towards your own living, and it's not just indexed to the present moment, but it's also indexed to your future states. So like when you're saying, it seems to me like you're saying there's a skill you're building up in preparation to handle the worst day of your life, basically.
Yeah, literally.
You have a duty towards yourself to cultivate your own strengths so that you can manage crisis, you can manage suffering, you can manage these hard things in your life. And that notion there, that duty to oneself, is the kind of duty that we would then project out to our own communities.
Yeah.
And I think that idea about like preparing for the worst day of your life is also something that is shared in common with forms of Eastern Stoicism that we might find, like say in Japanese Zen, for example.
Well, I mean, it's not as if like, I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of what is it? Is it synchronicity. There's this specific phenomena that they talk about where like, a lot of ancient cultures had like a giant snake as part of their mythology, like a giant snake that consumes the world or consumes something. So I can't remember what it's called. I want to say
Jung would call that an archetype, but I
right,
think
but there's an anthropological term.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like I think that similar things happen with other forms of thought too. So it would make total sense to me that we can look over in Asia or over in like fucking if we had the ancient writings of Native Americans more readily available to us, then like we could look at those and probably find similar lines of thought.
Yeah. This is a very good point. And this goes back, this is going to go to two things that I think are interesting. One is Nussbaum. So she talks about how there is something, she calls it universal human experience, which isn't to say that we all experience the same thing identically, but it is to say that there's a set of human experiences that we all share: sadness, grief, happiness, joy, blah blah blah, right?
Yeah, shitting.
Those things are like within a certain limit, right? Like we can't experience things humans can't experience. Like we don't have the vision of the rainbow shrimp where we can see all spectrums of the light. We don't we aren't bats. We don't have this echolocation where we can see with our ears, right? So that universal human cognitive thing that we all share to a certain extent, we can also maybe use the language of like Tom Regan and talk about species competence, for example. That thing we definitely see in other cultures that pop up all the time, and they might have different reasons for why they might come to the same conclusion, and that's part of why I think like unpacking the reasons is really interesting and can be important because the reasons can turn you on to a different conclusion that might be contradictory. But so that's
I think go ahead.
Oh, well, that's one part that's kind of cool, and the other part is we do actually have a codex from the Aztecs, and it's basically one of the few written documents we have of indigenous philosophy from Central America, South America, and in that document, we find a lot of similarities with ancient Greece and some Buddhist sects from India. Namely that the moral duties are couched in virtue. That it is the character of the person acting and the action, and in fact, for those in these Aztec stories, it is your own thoughts that are guiding these things that make it important, and the way you speak about them. That is how they really framed their action. So like, for example, in Buddhism, you have this thing called right speech. And right speech isn't something like a Christian might think of it, where there are these words you can't say, otherwise you sin and you have to follow these rules or something like that. Right speech is something more like acting honestly, speaking with the right kind of character, speaking virtuously. So that means like not speaking to be cruel to your fellow man, not speaking to be dishonest, things like that. And so, the Aztecs had a very similar notion and a huge emphasis on our speech, because that was the way we connected with each other. And so if our moral actions are about how we connect with each other, and speech is one of the primary ways we do that, then virtuous speech is one of the best ways we can be moral.
I wanna chip in for a second, Koco.
You're good.
I think with regards to speaking honestly, and I kind of think this is 75% from what I remember from Stoicism, 25 maybe something a bit newer. But I remember that if you speak honestly, there is a benefit to yourself. So it's a moral action that benefits you. But in terms of practical terms, if you were to lie to people, a lot of people, you would then have to remember the lies you told different people, so you won't have contradictions. So it's a very large cognitive burden, for example.
Yeah, totally.
And I think there are some other like justifications, like if you inductively think about it, why is it good to be honest for your own benefit? But the other one is if you start telling lies frequently, you will start seeing you will distort your own way of seeing reality correctly. Because you kind of like justify it in your head, you'll rash because you've done it to other people, you kind of like self-do it to yourself. So if you be honest, you don't have this cognitive burden of trying to remember what you lied to everyone, and you'll see the world more truthfully, more honestly, so you can interact with it more correctly. So that is and that is what the virtue you're trying to develop. And if you understand the benefit to yourself, then you should develop honesty, even when it's hard, even when it's difficult, even when you really want to not be honest. I mean, unless it's something like Kant's, like, is there an axe wielding murderer at the door? That one aside, but it's for your own benefit. You're developing your own virtue, and when you run into a hard situation where it's very difficult to tell the truth, but you do it anyway, that's how you develop your character.
Yeah, but again, I think this just goes back to what it is. So part of the reason that I think that Stoicism developed the way that it did was because it has efficacy in the way that it interacts with the brain. And that's why we see it throughout different societies in like completely different parts of the world that would have had no reason to have ever interacted with each other intellectually. Because these are pragmatic habits that happen to line up with the way our brain chemistry works, because we're undermining the reward system by establishing our own standards of reward. We're not going based off of what it is that everybody else thinks ought to be rewarding. We are saying, this is rewarding for me. I have won this small victory. I have accomplished this small goal. Now, I, body, have decided to give you serotonin and dopamine. I am the master, right? And I think that's why we see it all over the place, is because ultimately, like, what are we trying to do in creating goals, in interacting with people in a virtuous way? We're trying to be the kind of person that we want to be for whatever reason.
We're trying to get swole.
Some of us are trying to get swole.
No, I agree with you. I think that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, being like a person, a very virtuous person, like if you see if you look behind and say, well, look, I actually had a lot of adversities, and I acted very well, or acted surprisingly well during that time. And you can actually, I developing these virtues and developing my personality. That's not something you can put a dollar sign to. It's invaluable, and it's very, very dear to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Philosophical Zombie, like if you agree with Rand's ethics at all, but I've been reading more about her positions.
Oh, that's good.
And it seems to me like she does have something kind of similar to Aristotle.
Yeah, so
where it's kind of a virtue based, but like rationality is kind of the most human action that we have. Like we want to guide our virtues rationally, and that's how we would live well. I think that kind of is very compatible with this Stoic view.
there is an overlap, certainly, and there's a philosopher in objectivism that gave a talk about the differences between Stoicism and objectivism. Rand herself, a lot of the things from Rand is based from Aristotle. She does have her own virtue ethics, but she has 7 virtues that she stated. I think the differences is that, if I were to simplify that, the negative visualization and making yourself suffer in the case of the not getting off the hedonic treadmill, that wouldn't be something that objectivists would do.
Sorry, they would not get off the hedonic treadmill.
They wouldn't see it as something that makes sense, like to make yourself suffer intentionally. But everything else, like a lot of it, they would use. Certainly, like in some of her books, there are moments where the main character just switches outright to stoicism. Like this is legit stoicism right now. But yeah.
As someone who hasn't even read Ayn Rand, and I've just I've read excerpts, but I haven't really read any long form of her work. I think that something that people kind of forget about in Stoicism, because it ends up being so beneficial, is that ultimately it's profoundly selfish and self-absorbed, right? Like half of Stoicism is just about accepting that you can't change other things about the world, so that you should focus on yourself,
Yeah.
right? Well, that just happenstantially coincides pretty heavily with a lot of the ways that people interact with capitalism or interact with economic systems, right? Or even interact with other people.
Can I just layer that with one extra layer? So Spinoza technically developed from Stoicism. His ethics are similar, and it is also selfish.
Yeah.
So just add that as an additional layer to this overall layer cake, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Spinoza did come out of that, and I mean, you also there's this huge interplay with Christianity as well, just because Christianity was the dominant view in Europe, and Europe
and
also
Spinoza.
is where and well, Spinoza was Jewish, but certainly the Christian views were influential on Spinoza, because all the philosophers he was engaging with were Christian.
Augustine kept on accusing him of being I don't remember, it was Augustine. Someone was accusing him of being an atheist, and he kept on getting upset with him.
Even though he uses the word God more than maybe any other philosopher. I understand why, because he sort of, it's unclear if he's a panentheist or a pantheist, but either way, that would be heretical to the Christian church. At
absolutely.
That time.
Yeah, so
as someone who follows a lot of those religious beliefs in modern times, I can tell you, people still think I'm an atheist.
So he was there was that question, was he an atheist or was he a pantheist? And he was what was it, discommunicated or something from the Jewish something.
That's right, yeah.
Excommunicated, sorry. So he really felt very strongly about God. He thought God is God is everywhere in everything, or if you look at it today, God is between the molecules of everything. And at the time, it was really interesting, because it led to this scientific view of looking at the world. Because if you really love God, then you want to discover more about him, right? And God is in nature, God is in everything. So I think Einstein wrote a badly written poem to Spinoza, because he really appreciated his insight.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like when the Old Testament views came to Europe after Jesus, the nature of God's identity changed a lot. This is getting off topic of Stoicism, though. But
we can schedule that another time.
Sure, yeah. But I think the etymology of the word Yahweh gives us some insight into that.
Yehovah, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do a slight recap for the audience, and if we want to change the subject to something else, that's fine. But
I do want to get back to the goals thing that you were specifically asking about earlier.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. If you want, I was going to say after you'd give your summary. No, I think that, so you keep asking how do I set goals, or what would modern Stoicism say about setting goals? I think that what modern Stoicism would want to focus on is the idea of accepting reality in some capacity, because let's say I want to look like Zangief. We're talking about getting swole, because Arco loves getting swole. And I think to myself, this is what I have to do to get swole. I have my plan. I have all of my protein supplements. I have everything. And I go and I'm like, I'm going to do this workout that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson posted, but I've never done it before. And then I think to myself, I'm going to eat like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson eats all day. And Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson eats eight fillets of cod in a day. And like cod is dense. There's actually a YouTube video of a guy who tried to eat like Dwayne The Rock Johnson. He throws up like a lot. It's really gross. But
Okay.
Stoicism would say like, well, okay, like maybe those goals are something that's grand, or they seem grandiose to you now, but they're not grandiose to Dwayne The Rock Johnson.
Mhm.
Dwayne Johnson is walking around eating cod every day like it's no big deal. Like, oh, this is just what I fucking do. Well, our goal is to eventually be that way, is to where those things are no longer monumental. Those things are just simply our way of being. We're trying to create a new way in which we are in the world. And so we have to accept the ways in which we can be in the world as we build up to the way that we want to be. So instead of thinking, I'm going to eat like Dwayne The Rock Johnson today, I'm thinking, I'm going to hit my protein macros for the day. I'm going to be good about that. You know, if my protein macros is to get 120 grams of protein in the day, I'm going to hit that. Now that might be small, especially for someone who's like, if Dwayne, usually bodybuilders, weightlifters, people who are really, really like into muscle building, they eat 1.3 or no, is it 0.6? I can't remember exactly, but you basically eat almost your kilograms in protein grams a day, which is a lot. So like I weigh 270. If I wanted to be like building a lot of muscle, I'd be eating 135. I'd be eating like 120 grams of protein a day. That's a lot of fucking protein. That's basically like if I'd have to eat a lot of protein. So, like that's a tall order. But like if you look at it as this is an achievable thing, and you achieve it, well, that's a small victory in comparison to what it is that Dwayne The Rock Johnson does. But it's a huge victory in the sense of what it is that you get to do. So what we're doing in goal setting is accepting the reality of the ways in which I am currently, being thankful for the ways in which I am currently, because they are how I ended up where I am, and there's nothing I can do about them. And then pursuing the way that I want to be in a way that simultaneously accepts myself as who I am and pushes myself forward. Does that make sense?
Okay. Accepting who I am. What does that mean?
Yeah. So like, did you dated before you met your wife, I assume, right?
Yes.
Okay. And a lot of those relationships, obviously, all of them were unsuccessful until this one.
Yes.
And you like, we still don't even know if this one's going to be successful, right? I mean, like shit happens, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we all hope, and I pray that your relationship is profoundly successful and fulfilling. But like,
I'm positive this is going to work out forever.
At least until one of you dies, because nothing lasts forever. But if you look at all of those relationships before, do you really think that you would have met your wife or fallen in love with your wife if you hadn't had all those previous relationships? Do you think the conditions necessary for you to be in the situation that you are now would have been met?
To be honest, I'm not sure if I can answer on the spot. I don't know.
See, my answer would be no. I think that the world, everything is so complex. It's like this giant Rube Goldberg machine where like the marble drops and then a salt shaker tips over and then something runs along a wire and like ultimately to pop the balloon at the end of this Rube Goldberg machine, an infinite number of highly specific things had to happenstantially occur in a specific temporal order of your experience for you to actually get to pop that balloon. So without all of your previously unsuccessful relationships, without every single tiny little experience that you had, you would have never met your wife. My girlfriend would have never moved in with me. If I, like, something as small as when I was a small child, the first time that I ever swore in front of my parents was I said, "Goddamn flies." If that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have met the woman that I'm dating right now. I wouldn't have ended up with the job that I have now. That's how I think of it, right? All of these very specific, tiny little things are, I'm going to call them forks in the road, but I'm going to say they're like infinite forks in the road. There's an infinite number of ways in which these things, my life could have gone. I'm always on the precipice of my life going in a certain direction. in every moment. Like the very fact that we're having this conversation means my life will go in another direction that it wouldn't have gone otherwise if I had slept in and missed this conversation. And so me accepting that all these things that I had absolutely no, maybe not absolutely no, but all these things that I had minimal volition in is the act of accepting myself. Because myself is the sum of all of those things that have happened and the ways in which I've interpreted them and interacted with them. And part of this is where like the little like woo-woo stuff kind of comes in, is that like my body reacted to those things in a specific kind of way in order to have the most or the highest likelihood of success for survival, because that's what I'm evolutionarily inclined to pursue, is a success, is a survival and success in surviving. Or sorry, and success while I'm surviving. And my body has a natural autopilot setting to attempt to do that. And so I am thankful and accepting of the fact that my body in its limited capacity did things to get me to survive and succeed, even if I didn't end up surviving and succeeding. But I accept and am thankful for all of the ways in which my body has interacted with all of these things.
And all of us are thankful that our body interacted with COVID-19 and survived.
I mean, yeah, we should be.
Yeah.
And in some weird way, I'm thankful for all of this, the bullshit that's come up for it. I have to be, I think an attitude of gratefulness, an attitude of thankfulness is just ultimately much more beneficial to us as individuals than any other kind of attitude would be. Because like, can I do anything about COVID as an individual? No.
Well, you could choose some things, but you don't have too much control.
No, like I'm not gonna be able to go walk over to like fucking Joe Biden and say like, dude, you're taking away people's bodily autonomy by requiring vaccines in order to go places.
But we're gonna wind
I
it
don't
down.
necessarily believe that.
Okay, we're gonna wind it down from politics, though. Go ahead.
Yeah. But like I'm just trying to say, like, I don't have the ability to change some of those things. The only thing that I have the ability to change is how I respond to them, how I interact with others, the way I treat myself, and the way I treat others. And that's a big point, I think, is Stoicism is not about the way that you treat others. This is why I think it's so selfish and people kind of miss this point. It's about the way that you treat yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Stoicism is focused on the way that you treat yourself, because you're treating yourself as if it's its own individual entity, because it is. You know, my sister last night was talking about how like, oh, I'm never going to be able to have this or have that because I won't have a partner. And like, I'm like, you do have a partner. You are your partner. You know, I don't think that there's necessarily some like body mind dichotomy or some soul body dichotomy, but like ultimately there is a way in which you are in the world that requires no thought. And there is a way in which you can be in the world that requires an insane amount of thought.
Hey, I told you that one.
What?
That
What'd
was
you
me.
say?
I told you that one. That was me.
Was it? I'm not sure.
In our free will debate.
Maybe, yeah. I think I've held that belief for a little while, but
Continue.
if
Yes,
you
continue.
echoed it, I'm not surprised. We're both fucking geniuses, so what do you expect?
This is true. Continue. Sorry, what was your line of thought?
No, that's okay. I appreciate you bringing it up. And I'm happy that you influenced my opinion. But if we look at it that way, then like, guess what? I'm never alone. There's this speech, this commencement speech that David Foster Wallace gives that I quote all the time, and it makes me feel really like lame that this is my only source that I can draw on it from, but I love this speech so much. It's called This Is Water. And he makes this really kind of like simple point that might not have any scientific or logical backing, but it has like a Jungian type of backing, where when people kill themselves, where do they point the gun? At their head. Right? They blow their brains out when they kill themselves most often. And he says, I don't think it's a coincidence. There's a saying that the mind is a terrible master. And it is, right? That's why you should be the master of your mind. Because we ought to think of the mind as being this incredibly simple organ that has a function. And we also have a portion of our mind that has another function, which is to master the lesser portions of the mind. we think of things of above us as being, and you see this in almost all animals. When something is above an animal, it, like in dogs, for instance, like height away from the ground or away from the pack represents hierarchy, right? Like if you have the high ground in a dog pack, you are in charge. And this is silly in my opinion, because if you take this to humans, it's like, well, if I stand on a chair, but like when someone is standing on a stage, they're elevated. Well, what is the prefrontal cortex? It's elevated above all of the other things. And I'm not saying that that necessarily means there's some sort of scientific way to back this, but like perhaps there is some archetypical way to back this, to say, when I look at this, I look at the higher functions of my mind as literally being above, and their job is to master the lower functions. But the lower functions aren't separate from. It's kind of like a Shakespearean play where like the brain is on the center of this round stage that's slightly elevated above all the other people who are sitting down on the ground. It's not as if any of those people can't just immediately stand up and interact with the thing that's on the stage. But we master those things that are sitting around us and observing the stage by demanding their attention, by demanding their subservience and their silence.
Yeah, I mean, I was nodding a lot. You just can't see me to what you're saying. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
I think.
Oh, cool dogs.
I think that's how we would look at goal. I think that's how we look at goal setting.
Okay.
This actually, my comment goes immediately to this goal setting idea. So there's the Roman virtue of viritus or viritus, however you want to pronounce it. There's debate on that, which translates directly to something like virility, but it's really virility, masculinity, raw, go get 'em type of attitude, right? So like the great general holds like high levels of viritus, right? High levels of virility, right?
Huge cock.
So my question behind this, with this idea of this virtue, is if there isn't something valuable in having a go-getting attitude where you are driven towards living the life that you want, pursuing your goals, etc. And so I'm wondering if Stoicism doesn't downplay the fulfillingness of driving towards some goal, towards the life that you want to live, something like that.
Is that like a question or just a statement?
Yeah, so I'm wondering if Stoicism doesn't discount this phenomenon and how it can be helpful to you, having that raw, go get 'em type of attitude, and how you can be fulfilled through such a virtue.
Yeah, well, I think that this goes back to the idea of acceptance, right? When we're looking at like, what is it that I can accept? So I was talking about how Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson just does this thing and assumes it to be part of his regular way of being.
Sure.
Right. So ultimately, like, let's say that I wanted to have that go-getter action. I'm a early 20-something-year-old dude who's been rejected by a bunch of women. I'm listening to Sigma male videos and thinking that like this is the way that I should be, right? I should be this fucking Sigma male. Like, and then you start going through your days trying to be this person. Well, like ultimately, like that isn't accepting who you are, right? I think that that guy who has that veritus, right? Like that's just part of his way of being. It's his natural way of being. So if like if I want confidence to be a part of my everyday life, then I should do the things that make confidence part of my everyday life until it becomes so automatic that it naturally has overcome the other ways of being.
So I'm going to use a little bit of like existentialist / phenomenological language here and say like, yeah, sure, I agree with all of that. You're always thrown into your current existence, right? In your current life, based upon like your previous choices, things you can't choose, et cetera, et cetera. You're obviously going upon like a certain trajectory. But my point is that not everybody is born into this state where they are automatically virtuous in this example of The Rock, right?
Yeah.
And so the point here is, right, isn't Stoicism kind of just a shrug your shoulders for people who aren't already at that place, when in fact some positive motivation to, again, using existential phenomenological language, to like project into the future and take one of those futural possibilities of your life into your own sort of you know, and that being an anchor for then doing the acceptance later after we've grappled with what we want to be first, right? And so I'm wondering if Stoicism doesn't discount the ability for people to reform themselves and live a more fulfilling life through their own positive motivation of saying, look, it's I don't want the now that I am. I want to be something else, right?
Well, I don't think that necessarily accepting the way that you are now means that you can't be something else. I think that we all have infinite possibilities within us. Like, I am just as likely to be someone who's homeless on the street and destitute and drug addict as I am to be someone who's a moderately successful 30-year-old, in my opinion. Like, I think I'm always on the precipice of disaster in some capacity. And that is just a part of life. And I think that, you know, I've mentioned the idea of acceptance a lot. I think there's a specific time in which Marcus Aurelius is nearing the end of his life where he basically says, like, I will die and ultimately I won't be remembered. Now, we remember Marcus Aurelius, but I would bet dollars to fucking donuts that for 90% of the time that Marcus Aurelius has been dead, people weren't thinking about him that often or saying his name that often. And even in the grand scheme of all of existence, the amount of times in which I've said his name is infinitesimal to the amount of times that everybody else on the entire planet has said anything else, right? It's useless. It's fucking meaningless. It has meaning to me, but in the grand scheme of existence, it's useless. And that's basically what Aurelius is wrestling with, right? He's basically saying, like, you know, like, well, what's the fucking point if it's all pointless? Well, then he kind of looks at it, and I think Epictetus says this as well, like, ultimately, you have to accept that it's pointless. Because to try and live as if it is purposeful or there's a point to it outside of your own little sphere of experience is purposeless. It's not going to solicit anything. It's one of those things that's outside of your control. Because there are way more people than there is me. You know? There's one me, there's a billion other people in the world. I'm ultimately the only person who's going to care about the things that I do in 500 years.
If PZH wants to respond to this, I do have a follow-up to this.
So I think I don't know if it was Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus said that if you were born to be a homeless person with just a shirt on your back, then try to be the best homeless person you can be, or try to be the best you can be with your situation. It was
I think
always
it was Epictetus because of the slavery thing.
Yeah, it was never like it was just do the best with what you have and focus on your own virtues.
But my follow-up to this, okay, embrace the meaningless of life or whatever, is like, okay, right? But there is one thing that you do control, right? And that thing that you do control is how you're progressing towards, again, using existentialist language, is like the way that you're progressing towards your own death. That is something that is in your control, and what sort of possibilities you want to bring into actuality, we could say, right? And so I'm wondering here if there's not enough emphasis on, as PZH is saying, on what being the best looks like, right? And there's too much emphasis on whatever, it's meaningless, things won't change or whatever, right? And so I'm wondering if there is a little room to bring in the idea that you are sort of the master of your own destiny, and you should hold wearitus, right? Is the idea.
So there is a concept of locus of control in Stoicism, and there are things that you control and things that you do not, and or there could be a trichotomy in some cases where things you can influence. But essentially, Stoicism would say on the things that you can control, focus your effort in that area and try to improve it as much as you can, and that way, in other parts of Stoic teaching, you would live a good life in those situations. What does a good life look like? What does the best look like? That is kind of personal, in a sense. There is some kind of generic advice, like all humans will benefit from telling the truth. All humans will benefit from X, Y, and Z, because it's just similar in some way. But that's potentially like 20%. 80% you're gonna have to figure out on your own.
So I'm gonna finish here, and then I'll go back to being a silent dweeb. But but sorry, but Right. I think that although I agree with this and all of this, but I think that like precisely what some people need is a kick in the ass to feel the pain, to then do the pull up by bootstraps approach. I'm not saying everybody, not saying all people,
No.
right? But I think that there is room here to embrace the suffering of your situation as a motivational force that will then produce a type of virtue in you while reveling in the existence that you're currently in, while trying to get out of your situation. Like the point is for the beggar or the slave, their ultimate goal is not to be the best beggar possible, but to not be a beggar anymore, right? And so there's where like my difficulty with being completely a stoic and not just like a stoic in specific situations or around particular things, right? I think stoicism's great in certain arenas, but it's that when you need that paradigm shift in your own life, I don't think stoicism gives you the tool to do that, right?
Yeah, well, and I would agree that like in isolation, and I think like let's look at the anthropology of like of our past ways of being, of the past ways that humans were. Like if we look at almost every mythology, there is the presence of something that decides the fate of everybody. Like we look at Oedipus, we look at all the Greek dramas, like uh Oedipus was destined to, no matter what he did, fuck his mom and gouge his eyes out. Prometheus was destined to be bound to the rock until Chiron gave up his immortality and Hercules came and took him from the rock, right? Those things were all destined. There was no way to avoid them. And any number of ways in which Oedipus tried to avoid them, they happened. The same thing is true of like Norse mythology. They have these things called the Norns, and the Norns decide the fate of everybody who lives and dies. The only person in Norse mythology who tries to undermine that is Odin, and he suffers greatly for it and still ultimately ends up suffering the consequences of fate. So no matter how much anybody toils against fate, they always end up suffering. They always end up doing exactly what fate told them to do or said that they were going to do. And I think that that's like ultimately, this is undermined by existentialism at some point. That Nietzsche's first, like his doctorate, is written about Greek dramas. And that's why I think when we look at modern Stoicism, it's inseparable from existentialism, because existentialism in itself is based intrinsically on some of the ideas of perception of reality that come from Stoicism. They're not separable. So when we're looking at modern Stoicism, we're basically adding the tools of saying, well, we're not bound by fate. You know, I'm willing to look at things and say that there is no value to fate. I get to decide that because I'm a Scorpio and a Sagittarius moon and this bullshit, like it used to be that meant my life would go a certain way. Well, now I get to look at that as a toolkit to examine the way in which my life might go, if I choose to do that. Or I can just choose to not give that stuff credence at all. But in the past, their way of being, their society said that if you had something that was fated to occur, it would happen no matter what. And so I would agree with you completely that Stoicism by itself is this very temporal, isolated way of thinking that basically says, like, well, I have to accept the things that are going to happen to me because that's just fate. But that's just because that was the way that they thought. It wasn't until you get or other things introduced, until you get like economic mobility introduced as like an intrinsic part of society, that we can start to think, well, maybe I don't have to be a beggar, right? Like if you look at the in the Bible, in the New Testament, right, when Jesus is going around and he's like healing people and all this stuff, like when people would see beggars on the side of the road, they would think, oh, well, that's just their fate. Their fate is to be a beggar, like they will be a beggar forever. And that's part of what makes Jesus so radical, is that he says, you don't have to be a beggar forever. I can come and heal you. You can be healed of this thing. And that like the burdens of fate are really just the burdens of self, and that fate isn't a thing. Your fate is a perception that you have of the things that happen to you. And so I think that if we take that more realistic view of Stoicism and say, well, like there's nothing that's fated to happen, but there are things there are consequences to everything. A consequence, or the consequence of me not wanting to work a 9-to-5 job might be that I don't get to live in a certain way unless I find other ways in which I can live that way. But if I look at that as fate, like you're saying, or like Cool Dog was saying, then like ultimately I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to get that kick in the pants to pull myself up by my bootstraps. So then we incorporate this new element of modern Stoicism and say, well, ultimately I have a choice over all of these things. I have the ability to overcome this natural autopilot way of being by mastering the thing that tells me that I don't have any other options. Because it's your brain that tells you you don't have any other options. When I'm standing in my kitchen with my hand over the sink, freaking out, thinking like, I'm going to lose the ability to play guitar. I'm never going to play guitar again. Like, that was the thought that was running through my head, and it really upset me because I love music. I studied music in college. For 7 years, I studied music almost exclusively. Of course, I did philosophy and English on the side because I love those things too, and I ended up graduating with an English degree. But I love music, and so I was standing at the sink thinking, I'm going to lose my hand. I need to go to the emergency room. I have to go to the emergency room. Well, I'm the only person that thinks I have to go to the emergency room. If we look objectively at the way that the world is, I have an infinite number of options in which I could choose to act, and still ultimately there would be a consequence to them. There's still a consequence to me going to urgent care. There's a consequence to me going to the emergency room. It's not necessarily about saying that, like, oh, I have to do this one particular thing. It's about acknowledging that no matter what I do, something else will occur afterwards. So how do I make decisions that will solicit the thing that I want to occur afterwards happening rather than something that I have no control over? Because if I just go with the thing that I think I have to do, then I'm going to end up with a consequence that I think I had to experience. And that's not how I like to look at it. I have to experience a consequence. I have power and volition over what that consequence is. And I should desire for that consequence to be something that I can accept. But I can't change all of the things that led up to the thing that I'm occurring. I can't change that I was being dumb with a knife and pointed it towards my hand while I was working with a piece of frozen meat. I can't change that. It's already happened. It's done. But what I can change at this point is whether or not I go to the emergency room and end up $800 in debt to my insurance company, or if I go to urgent care and end up with no out-of-pocket cost and I think maybe $50 to my insurance company. And ultimately, that's a consequence that I want. But I know that I'm going to have a consequence no matter what. So I'm picking the one that I can deal with, picking the one that I can live with. And the same thing is true of setting goals, of overcoming my status as a beggar. Like, I don't want to be a beggar anymore. How is it that I become not a beggar? Right? Well, I have to accept that I am a beggar first. It's the same thing as like Alcoholics Anonymous. Anonymous. I have to accept first that I am an addict. I am an addict to alcohol. I'm smoking a cigar right now. I am an addict to tobacco, to nicotine. Like, I've been struggling with quitting smoking cigarettes for a long time because, you know, whatever you want to call it, silly or whatever. I don't think smoking cigars is that unhealthy. Neither is smoking a pipe every now and then. But smoking cigarettes regularly and habitually, very unhealthy. So I wanted to eliminate that as a habit. I had to acknowledge first that it was a problem. I can't just say I'm not going to do this thing and then quit, like, because I don't want to. No, I need to acknowledge that it's an issue. I need to acknowledge that I want to change. And that, I think, is where originally Stoicism would have said, like, well, no, you're just fated to be addicted to tobacco forever. Well, no, I don't have fate. I have consequences. And so there are consequences that are going to happen no matter what. And the same thing happens with goals, right? There is a consequence to wanting to look like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. It doesn't have to be negative, but there are consequences. My conditions of existence will always be in an ever changing landscape. My life is always changing, whether it's small or large. And ultimately, the way in which I perceive those things is up to me. The way in which I choose to do things is somewhat up to me. And I can't change all the things that led up to how it is that I choose to be, but I can choose how I'm going to be in the future by resetting my autopilot, by resetting the idea that I have to be a beggar to think I don't have to be a beggar. I don't have to be stuck with anything that's been foisted upon me. I think that's the word, foisted. It's Camus wrote about Sisyphus. I don't know if anyone's read this, but Camus wrote about how Sisyphus fell in love with the boulder. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Sisyphean myth. I assume most of you, but like the idea is that Sisyphus cheated death a bunch of times or he answered a question incorrectly. I can't remember which person he was that ended up with this punishment, but he ends up with this punishment of carrying a boulder up to the top of a hill, and then he sets the boulder down. It's like, yeah, I'm done with this fucking boulder, and then it rolls down to the bottom. Well, the punishment is he has to carry it up to the top of the hill every day. It's the same thing as Prometheus getting his liver eaten out by a vulture in the underworld. Like every day, no matter what, this same thing will happen. Ultimately, Stoicism says, I will fall in love with this thing that is happening, and I will decide that it is no longer a punishment. So there are certain things that won't change. It is inevitable that I will experience suffering. It is inevitable that I will have to do things that I don't want to do. What I get to do is change the autopilot setting that I have on how I perceive those things. It no longer is a burden to carry the boulder up the hill. I love the boulder.
Well, I thought that was a really good insight there, Koco.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, thank Camus and André Gide. He also wrote an essay on it.
I'm going to have to go. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think everyone else did as well.
I enjoyed it too. I got to talk way more than I normally do.